Good morning, everyone. I am John Holloway, Director of DOD Office of Global Public Safety Comms at DISA headquarters on Fort Meade. And this morning we're going to have a panel on what's happening in the world of public safety comms. It's kind of complex and a lot of people don't understand it. So our panelists are going to be Al Broussard, who's the CEO and President of Exacom. He's going to speak on behalf of the Federal Next Gen 911 Interoperability Working Group. We have Sridhar Noyinli, who's with DHS S&T, and their involvement with Next Gen Public Safety Comms. And at the end, we have John Marcy, who is the President and CEO of Netmaker Communication, who is my lead seated contractor. Before I turn into letting them do their talk, I want to give you guys some history on what we're doing, because this seems to get lost in what's happening. And this gets into policy and what we have to do across the DOD. So if you remember back in, I want to say June of 2020, C3 modernization strategy came out. And LOE 6 of that strategy says that public safety comms is now part of the DOD CIO portfolio. It is also on the list to be a critical core capability for the DOD. So what's happened is that public safety comms within the DOD has gone from basically the gutter and is now risen up to and on par with NIPR, SIPR, JWICs. The CIOs of the services have been directed to fund and POM for public safety comms starting in FY25. That is in the DOD CIO CPG document. So now we have the modernization document. So what comes next? Well, we have the DOD directive, 8422.01 Echo, which then directs DISA to stand up an Office of Public Safety Communications. That's me. I'm the only Govy in the office. I got 7 contractors. And I also have the lead for HF, which will be later this afternoon. But anyways, with all that said, seeing how public safety is now a critical core capability, it has to fall in line with various policy documents, such as DODI.
It still works.
There we go. DODI 3020.45 mission assurance. Okay, that's a big one. That means that when US Cybercom comes out and does a installation inspection for cybersecurity issues, they will now also look at all the connections related to public safety comms. Okay? We have 8110.01, the DIN transport, or the DOD transport. Okay, public safety comms, as it's been in the past, has been hither-tither, connected to HEMR, and whatever, okay? It's been a bag of worms. Now, as we get ready to move forward, DOD, we're going to be building out our PSI net. It's going to ride the DOD. And there's other things. We got 8130. We have mission partner environment stuff we have to do. What hasn't been done in the past is be compliant with the Privacy Act of 1974. So we got to go back and fill all that in. So this is some of the stuff that is going on today that hasn't been done previously. Okay, so some of you guys, well, You know, we can do this. We can connect to, you know, Joe Schmo over here or whatever. Not anymore. That's all that thought has to go away. The other thing that's happening is that the Next Generation 911 Interoperability Oversight Commission is going to be pushing PKI certs out to all 6,000 PSAPs across the country. So when a PSAP gets ready to exchange information with another PSAP, they're going to have to do the PKI Kabuki dance. DOD is going to be doing the same thing. We may be using a different vendor, but we still have to do the PKI Kabuki dance. Because as we transfer from TDM to IP, we're opening ourselves up to vulnerabilities. And this morning, and I'm not going to go into detail, is that I heard a report that comes out monthly of various public safety entities that have been hacked. It's going on daily, okay? And right now it's the soft belly of the critical infrastructure of the U.S. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to Al. That's some of the history that we have to contend with, some of the policies that we have to put in place. So Al, you have it.
Thank you, John. So good morning, everyone. As John said, my name is Al Broussard. I'm President and CEO of Exacom. For those of you who don't know us, we're a call recording software company that's JITC certified, so we record all kinds of communications. We have a heavy focus on public safety. So you can imagine we interoperate with over 80 different systems on a PSAP, so interoperability is key to us, which is why I'm so involved in this topic. In addition, I'm on the board of ICERT. ICERT is a large consortium of vendors who focus on the public safety market. So if you know a brand in that space, it's likely part of ICERT. So we're a consortium there. And I'm recently chair of the Interoperability Task Force Steering Committee, which I'm going to talk to you about today. So a little history, and this, there's a lot of stuff here that there's a lot of organizations that have been trying to figure this out from a testing perspective for 911. NINA specifically, who wrote the standard for I3, which all the vendors are adopting and implementing to, has been working with ICERT specifically and NASDA for years, trying to figure out how do we get this out there and an ability to test this so it's very easy to deploy. Also, in the absence of anything happening, by the way, other organizations like the state of New York, Cal OES, others tried to create their own labs because interoperability was so key to them that they tried to put something together. And then also National 911 Office got involved. And then most recently DHS and TAMU, who also said, hey, this problem still exists, we got to do something. And they were instrumental in actually putting together funding to actually start to do some pilot programs to move this along. So in the absence of everything actually happening, we finally all got together and decided, hey, this needs to be fixed. So a public-private partnership of some sorts got together to be able to try to figure this out. We created a summit that happened in August of last year. We had multiple organizations, CISA, Department of Transportation, DISA. I mean, there was a number of organizations there that came together to brainstorm about what do we have at our disposal, how can we take this forward and really start to create something that's really interoperable. So out of that came the NG911 task force, of which the people in red there are founding members of that organization. And since that time in August, we've created a charter, we've created the committees, and we are planned for our next summit on March 2nd at 911 Goes to Washington. So that's kind of the background of how it started. The premise is really based on, we have a standard finally. It's the version 3 of I3 standard, and it's predominantly what all the vendors are actually working to develop. So now that we have a standard, the key is to conform to that standard. All of us has to conform to have the ability to interoperate. And then the more that we can test, the more likely we will achieve interoperability in an accelerated fashion. So that's the premise of driving this forward. The objective of the actual program is to make it, I want to stress this, most cost effective, because this has to be able to be done quickly, cost effectively, so it doesn't impact the actual 911 PSAPs from a cost perspective. It needs to make all the vendors and all of us work together really well, but it can't be significant cost. So one of the key aspects of this program is that we are developing scripts for conformance testing. So we have a team that's actually working in all the different use cases. There'll be scripts developed that are going to be open sourced. So if you can imagine, if you're a software company, that's key because all of the scripts that are developed will be able to be absorbed into every vendor's QA process, right? So it becomes part of their development cycle. Every time there's a new script that's developed for a new use case, that can be immediately added to the test cycle, the automated testing of every software vendor, and make it part of their ingrained delivery of product for next generation 911, so that when they go to actually certify for testing, it should just work, and the certification should just happen. Another part of this is that it will drive test laboratories. TAMU is the first lab that DHS has actually graciously funded to create that first lab, but that will be more labs, hopefully. They'll create all the processes, all the scripts, that'll all be made available to any other lab that wants to create a business case to say, hey, I want to do some certification testing for this program. The other piece of this is long-term, this is going to drive to full end-to-end interoperability. We're very quickly going to start with conformance testing, meaning component level testing. So we're doing various use cases on a component-to-component basis. But as it evolves, it'll go beyond and get to full end-to-end testing. And then probably also intercommunications, bring in radio, bring in mission-critical push-to-talk, other technologies communication-wise into the picture. And then I just want to stress the last part there. It's critical that the program be cost-effective and the testing and everything is equitable to all partners. Small companies who are very often innovative have to have just as much access to this lab as large companies who can very easily just take over the lab. That can't happen. So just the structure of this committee, it's very basic. There's a steering committee made up of the founding organizations, but right away, most of the authority is trying to be given to the other programs. There's a governance committee. There's a finance committee, which is trying to figure out how to fund it. And then there's a technical committee. All these things will work together. Because the technical committee is going to say what we need to do. Finance committee is going to figure out, well, this is what we need to do. How do we source the funding to make that happen? How are we going to create a program that makes it sustainable? And the governance committee is going to look over the top of it, make sure the oversight is there, and we're doing everything according to the best approach. So it's really very basic, but I'm happy to say that the participation is huge. Our technical committee, I want to say, is at least 40 people right now from different organizations within the government, within the vendor community, within standards bodies. It's gaining momentum, so this is going to pick up speed very quickly. And then the last slide I wanted to share with you is what the status is. So right now the committees are actively working independently to try to drive this forward. They're all preparing for the summit that we're having in March 2nd to present their work plans and timelines and things like that the steering committee will then weigh in on and work together to finalize the actual timeline for 2023 and what we can accomplish. But we're expecting, out of that committee or out of the meeting to have all those details, and those will be shared on our website. We use the TAMU website right now for the program. So as more and more information becomes available, we'll get that out on the website. So that was it for me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Al. One thing I want to ask, who here has heard of 988? Raise your hands. About what, half a dozen? 988 started in 21 when Congress passed the National Suicide Hotline Act. A few months later, FCC came out and said 988 is going to be the 3-digit number for individuals to dial to reach a mental health counselor. DOD is actively doing this with the VA crisis line, and doing it in the States is easy. Doing it overseas at our installations that go from Diego Garcia to Djibouti up into Saudi, through Europe and over into the Far East, that's a different story. But this is another thing that, whereas a lot of carriers don't have to do, we have to do it. So I just want to put that point out there. So, sure.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pull up my slides. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
I'm usually very loud, so it's probably okay. So I'm just going to quickly walk through the... Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. I'll speak up if you guys have trouble. So we've talked a lot about NG911. So a little background for those of you who don't know that a lot of there are 6,000 PSAPs nationwide. DOD is going to plan about 1,000 more, probably worldwide. So significantly, the really neat thing about NG911 is if you've seen, or 911 systems, if you've seen one, you've seen one, right? Because every single system is designed to operate with individual requirements of that particular jurisdiction. So now we're in a massive uptick of looking at, well, what happens nationwide? How do we manage this thing? How do we ensure systems are interoperable? So just a quick agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about why S&T. I don't know, we are probably we've got our hands in a lot of things that people just don't know. And so I'm going to give a little background on that, talk about what is the challenge that we're trying to solve, and then talk about our effort. I think Al did a great job of kind of interleaving things, but I'll give a little bit more detail, and then we can flush out. At the end, I think we'll have time for questions. So, authorities. We are, within S&T, we're called the Office for Interoperability and Compatibility. So under Title VI of U.S. Code, we actually had to form an office. And this came right after 9/11. So NG911 happens to be one program that we sort of developed into, but we have a number of other initiatives that are in play and might be of interest to all of you guys. So how many of you guys have heard of the P25 program, Project 25? Okay, so P25 stands for the Digital Standard for Land Mobile Radio Systems. Every police, fire, EMS, we use digital systems are using P25, Project 25, and of course all federal agencies. So we actually maintain a program called P25 Compliance Assessment Program. And so the intent here is every radio manufactured in the U.S. has to go through a detailed level testing at laboratories that we have sort of approved. And we oversee that program. So right now, for example, if you look at a Motorola radio, whether it's fire, EMS, or law enforcement, or any DHS component like DHS, DOJ, they all use Project 25 radios. So one of the things that we did do, because of Title VI, is we're supposed to evaluate and validate advanced technology concepts, including facilitating interoperable and emergency communication. So this is a sweet spot for us in terms of NG911. It makes sense, right? So for us to take a look at how do we ensure standards? Because the last thing we want is a bunch of NG911 systems to be deployed and then find out, oh crap, it doesn't work together. I'm not able to transfer call data if I have a mutual aid response, or I've got one jurisdiction trying to talk to another jurisdiction. So really, that's kind of why S&T's got involved in this. So what happens without interoperability? Again, each jurisdiction has to work by themselves, or each jurisdiction, like Cal OES right now, has to solve their interoperability issues and their standards compliance issues by themselves. And then once you fix a solution, how do you promulgate it? How do you ensure it exists everywhere else? Data and information can't be relayed across, and they have to go back to the old method of doing it, is 911. Manual methods. Calls can't be delivered to location data. Now, location data is probably one of the most important things that are coming out of NG911, specifically for DOD as well as for DHS, specifically with voice over IP systems, right? So, because you have a voice over IP system, I think it's worse for you guys, because you have a base, you've got a number of contractors who set up IT systems. Well, that's great. Guess what happened? Part of their interest is when they dial 911 from one of those contracted phones, they might be in Texas, but the company that did it is in Colorado. So when they hit 911, it goes to Colorado, right? Plus, how do you get them on base? And for bases, it's even more critical, because you could go out one gate, you will have to work with one jurisdiction, go out another gate, work with another jurisdiction, and those systems have to be interoperable. You have to be able to talk and send data and coordinate. So incident data and future data integration is going to be key to this. So testing challenges, I think Al, you referred to conformance. Well, if you're conformant to the standard, doesn't mean you're interoperable, right? If you're interoperable, doesn't mean you meet the standards. So, and then when the standard changes, you're sort of SOL. How do you go back and test? So part of our effort is to do 3 types of testing. One is what we're calling conformance, which is, hey, every single box or subsystem you have meets standards, right? Then you have the individual boxes that talk to other boxes. And then thirdly, you have end-to-end. You have a complete 911 system talking to another 911 system. And essentially what you're talking about is a complete IP network. How do you ensure all that works? Because you're not only sending data, you're sending multimedia. And I'll take a minute to talk about some of the other research that we're doing at S&T that you guys might not know about, and kind of give you an idea of where S&T's headed. So what we're going to be doing is ensuring end-to-end interoperability. And what we're trying to do is a rule of 3. So if you are a vendor, you have to test with 2 other vendors, right? So it could be a subsystem, it could be a data integrator. Now we have, in NG911 system, you have over 30 vendors that are building products of some sort. You have system integrators, you have carriers, they're putting boxes together. So we got to make sure that all of this works together. The permutations get fairly large. So program background, I think Al, you mentioned NINA, which is the the National Emergency Number Association. Forget that fact that we always deal with acronyms in federal government. Again, I talked about 911 systems being unique. There was no single approach. In 2019, we got together a bunch of federal agencies and said, how are we going to solve it? Well, we had no funding. So we actually formed a partnership between DHS, the Department of Transportation, and DISA was one of the key players that we got involved with and said, well, how are we going to solve it? So if you guys think federal agencies don't work well together, well, this is one example that you can probably cite. It's probably not a whole lot, but you can take this one to the bank in that we all shared funding. We put our money together and executed. So Department of Transportation helped us out, and we actually developed this program. So the intent was, we don't want to own this program. We want to develop the structure, the format, the content, and then very similar to P25, what we want at the end of the day is a web page that says, hey, these vendors have gone through the testing, and they are now grant eligible, so they can use federal grant dollars to actually buy NG911 systems that have been through the testing program. And we want to recommend that forward. And so we do that in P25 right now. We have SafeCom, which is a group of public safety practitioners in the U.S. Working with DHS CISA, actually develops recommendations that they say they have to be P25 for radios. We want to use the same approach. So if Congress ever passes the legislation and makes $10 billion available for next-gen 911 transitions, we certainly want our program to be one of the pieces that vendors can go to say, okay, our systems are approved, we can now tap into that $10 billion. So program stakeholders, you guys can take a look at this. I'm not going to read all of it, but the idea is we're all coming together, federal, state, local, vendors alike, to actually develop the structure and the format for moving ahead. And by the way, we anticipate that this program will not only be domestic but international. We've got the European folks who are also using the NE93. They've expressed a great deal of interest. The Canadians are certainly on board with the DRDC, which is the equivalent of, I think Canadians have, they don't have a civil and a defense, they have DRDC, who does both for Canadian defense. So they're part of the team as well. So program phases, so what do we do? So in phase one, we actually said, okay, what are the operational requirements? How do we test? What do we test? That was actually co-funded with DHS and Department of Transportation. We actually used a program called Office of University Programs, which does a lot of academic research. And we are actually working with a Center for Infrastructure Resilience out of University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And they partnered with Texas A&M to actually do some of this work, and we've mentioned Texas before. Phase two is actually build the test bed and say, you know, it's great to say these are the requirements you're going to test, but we want to make sure those requirements can be tested, what data needs to be collected, how do you ensure that vendors have followed the regulations. So we want to do that, and phase three is really an inject to get the program running. And what we want to do is development of test tools and development of the actual framework and the laboratory. So the intent is, in the future, we're going to put out a bunch of documents, and DHS is going to have a website dedicated to NG911 where we're going to post all this data. The idea is vendors will voluntarily come, and what we don't want to do is keep paying the labs. So this is the initial step. We'll document how do you stand up an ISO certified laboratory. You know, how do you develop those things and educate any vendor who wants to take over that responsibility to do that. So that's sort of the intent in the long term. And I think Al alluded to a finance committee that we have under the task force. And the intent is to make it a self-sustaining model. You know, government, we should just be providing oversight. We shouldn't be running the program indefinitely. It really should be defining the framework and really give vendors and industry a way to work together. So we talked about the task force. I don't think I'm going to get into much of it, but as an example, here's a bunch of people who are actually involved. So it's a great mix of vendors and local and state government as well as federal government. You can see Calgary 911 is also on there. They're doing a bunch of NG911 work. But again, this is just a snippet. As Al mentioned, there's 40 to 50 people, and we're being fully transparent. We're allowing people to come together and work together to define the program moving forward. So that's kind of all I had, and I'll turn it back over to you. Do you want to do questions at the end, or do you want to do? So I did want to tell you. I promised to kind of tell you what DHS S&T does. So I just talked about OIC, but DHS does R&D for first responders and all DHS components. So we do everything from artificial intelligence to clothing. So for example, we licensed firefighter gear that has nanotech filtration points because there was a huge amount of firefighters who are getting cancer. And so the idea is to do that kind of work. We're also doing NG911 artificial AI and machine learning, so that we think about telecommunicators having to answer calls. Now they're having to look at videos and images, and you can see what kind of mental toll it's going to take on them, not only increasing their workload. So we're actually processing videos to ensure that there are no deep fakes, that validating the videos that come in. If there's multiple videos, we're actually trying to figure out which one's best, and actually do some analytics and even describe the scene, so the telecommunicator doesn't have to kind of take a look at all of the videos in detail. And so, and what's great about that is we use SBIR, Small Business Innovation Program, to do that. And that topic was co-written by DOT and DHS together. And we are also doing another work on mission critical push-to-talk. If you guys know what that is, I'm happy to talk to you about that. But NIST actually developed a conformance tool for that. They built part of it, and so we're partnering with NIST again to develop the other part of it. So really partnerships that we're stressing here is a lot of federal agencies, a lot of people getting together to solve the problems that we have, and realistically contribute back.
All right. I have to show this disclaimer. Okay, so we're going to take a minute here and just kind of provide a requirements overview of what we're doing within the DOD as it pertains to public safety comms, and then break out the actual program in the architecture that we've created. There's 4 pillars that we'll talk about here today. And then we'll plug our symposium that's in Baltimore coming up, right? Yes, you can. Do you want to talk to this? You want me to talk to it? Okay. So our program is based on some key tenets that we pulled, the DOD Modernization Strategy document there, and some of this Mr. Holloway talked about earlier. And then this went into the C3 strategic plan, and then the National Emergency Communications Plan. All of these, we extracted the requirements that kind of gave birth to the new directive, which is the DOD Directive 8422.01 ECHO that just got signed out not too long ago. So that's the first foray for the Department of Defense into this space, giving us clear direction on the path forward, which is in essence upgrading the current TDM public safety infrastructure to IP. So there's a lot involved with this, as you may know. As we go from TDM to IP, we within the DOD have been actively working on TDM elimination since 2010. So it's an ongoing exercise. So this community of interest has finally just got caught up. So we're moving to IP. The DOD currently today has about 220 PSAPs globally that we have to look at upgrading from their current TDM state to IP. One of the key takeaways on this is that as we go to IP and we start connecting these PSAPs to the DOD, that is where the vulnerability play comes in, and there's cybersecurity requirements that this community is going to have to adhere to that they are not accustomed to. So getting ATOs is going to have a whole new meaning to this community of interest going forward that they're not today got experience with. There we go. So This is a cartoon that kind of breaks down the program that Mr. Holloway is the director of. There's 4 specific pillars. The first pillar is the focus of getting everything from 911, E911 to next-gen 911. And that is focused mostly on the PSAPs and standing up a public safety IP network on the DOD backbone. That'll be a private DOD ISINet, basically, that the PSAPs will interconnect to, and the VoIP infrastructure of the DOD will interconnect with. The idea currently, you'll see here in a minute in a cartoon, we have local connectivity to a local exchange where 911 calls are being pushed out, and we've been relying on the municipal exchange to, in essence, process those calls and get them routed to a PSAP. There is a requirement within the DOD CIO that those legacy PRI TDM connections have to come to an end by March 2025. And that's in alignment with one of the FCC rulings that's basically telling the carriers, drop the copper and go to IP. So the current contract that the DOD uses for PRI telecom, the GSA EIS contract, there was a bridge negotiated, but all of that comes to an end in March 2025. So there's going to be a mad push within the Department of Defense to get all those TDM PBXs upgraded to IP, and there's a mass adoption to the Teams phone system as an easy button to get us to IP quicker for all of the unclassified telecommunication requirements in the Department of Defense. So as we move to IP, we have to be able to accommodate 911 calling within that environment. If I make a 911 call, whether it's on a Teams client or whether it's on a piece of plastic on someone's desk, I have to be able to capture that call, route it to the appropriate PSAP in compliance with next-gen 911. We'll talk about what that means here in a minute. Pillar 2 is the wireless. That is the next-gen public safety wireless update exercise, and that is focused primarily right now on updating the legacy LMR space within the Department of Defense. Each of the components has and owns their own LMR infrastructure, and it's mostly tied to command and control use, and public safety is a user of that infrastructure. But as we move forward with P25, which we heard about here this morning, that introduces new encryption capabilities. There is a plethora of updates as far as feature and functionalities for interoperability within that P25 space. The idea, obviously, from a wireless perspective is to allow DOD first responders to be able to communicate via LMR with their municipal counterparts. We had an exercise not all that long ago at the Navy Yard in DC with an active shooter, and 911 was called there at the Navy Yard, and the DC first responders responded, got to the gate, but there was no way for them to communicate with the first responders on the Navy Yard because they were on separate RF platforms, basically. So P25 gives us a mechanism or a path forward in order to accomplish interoperability where we can share talk paths and facilitate communications between DOD first responders and municipal first responders. An absolute must-have. The other side is wireless broadband. So you probably have heard of FirstNet. That's something that the Department of Commerce published out. So AT&T was the winner of that particular contract. It is a private LTE network across the country dedicated for supporting the first responder community. There's a lot of conversation about the idea that somehow LTE smartphones are going to replace LMR radios. No, that's not the case. It's another tool to facilitate communications between first responders, but I will tell you unequivocally that LMR is not going anywhere. These first responders depend on LMR. They have the range and the survivability that LTE smartphones will never have. So we've got to have a means of bridging those two ecosystems to facilitate crosstalk communications. And there are FirstNet apps coming up on the platform to provide that gateway functionality. We're looking at technologies within the LMR space called ISSI, interoperability subsystem interfaces, that will provide some of that bridging or that gateway functionality between those two environments. We're looking at other RF communication services to include HF, which Mr. Holloway is also involved with, whereby we can leverage HF radios to provide range extensions for first responders. So if we're in an environment like in a weapons test range, it would be pretty easy for a first responder to drive out of range of their LMR network. And then what do they fall over to? A lot of them go radio silent until they're back within range. So the idea of augmenting HF as a potential path to do range extension off of the public safety radio environment is an area that we're going to start experimenting with. The last pillar, the Army is actually the executive agent for, which is the emergency mass warning and notification systems. So these mass warning and notification systems today are predominantly installation centric, and there is a requirement to create an enterprise of this capability. And the Army has the lead on that. They're building out the acquisition strategy. But that represents Pillar 4, and that is one of the programs that we are cooperating with the Army on. So a little bit of a deeper dive on Pillar 1 is the Public Safety Next Gen 911 initiative. And as I mentioned, 842201 Echo was signed out just last year. We're working in concert with the DOD CIO office to publish the complementary instruction, the DOD 8423, which we hope to get signed out before the end of the calendar year. This will provide much more details as far as roles and responsibilities across the department as it pertains to public safety comms. So we've got a number of architectures that we've completed a technical architecture document that's been presented up to the Pentagon. It's out for staff review right now. It'll become the official blueprint for the components to build to and to resource against. We expect to have that approval here by the 1st of May. We've completed a business case analysis against that recommended architecture. That has all been reported up to the appropriation committees at the House and Senate. So we are actively engaged with trying to raise the necessary capital to pay for this, because the components today within their current budgets, they don't have the money. So we've got to go get the money. We have to make the business case to Congress to go get it. So this cartoon kind of gives the OV1 of the said architecture, and the view on the right is the current state that we're dealing with, where we've got legacy installations that either have a PSAP on the base, or they are dependent on a municipal PSAP for processing 911 calls. All of the bases have some local dispatch capability, i.e. their fire departments, their police departments, or what have you. So we either have a DOD PSAP that supports that dispatch functionality, or the municipal PSAP has the telephone numbers to be able to reach those on-base dispatch communities to be able to get a first responder to respond to an incident. But today, as you can see, it's all TDM. I've got probably 90% of the base installations out there today are still running on old Nortel, Avaya, PBXs that all have to go away by March 2025. So those PRIs are going away. The CAMA connections that feed the DOD PSAPs are going away. So what we've got on the left side represents the future. That is our transition end state. Leveraging the DODN on the unclassified side, we're going to introduce policy engines as a means of being able to do location-based routing. So what this means in detail, when you get into the I3 standard, we have to deploy what's called local information services, these LIS services down at the installation level. that is coupled with a GIS store. So bases have to be mapped. I've got to move that GIS data to a next-gen 911 compliant format. And when an end instrument, whether it's a soft phone or a hard phone, or anything in between, makes a phone call, it needs to be able to dip that LIS to get its information, and it needs to submit that information within the header of the SIP field before it sends it out onto the network. Those policy engines will then route the call to the appropriate PSAP based on the location in the SIP header, and that is a GIS reference. So in the old days, we would have an alley record with a street address, and we would match that up at the PSAP once the phone call came in. In this particular case, the location is put in at the beginning of the call within the SIP header in the form of a GIS XY coordinate reference. And I will route that call over the network to the appropriate PSAP that has the jurisdiction responsibility for that coordinate. It's pretty complex, but this is the future, and this is where the commercial market is going, and we have to follow. So when you look at it from the context of the voice modernization activities that are going on across the department, we've got a number of different variants that could show up depending on the component. The Navy's doing something slightly different than the Air Force, who's also doing slightly something different from the Army, who's slightly doing something different from the Marine Corps. So we had to account for all the possible variants, but at the end of the day, as they all move to IP, they will be serviced with a new soft switch backbone that will be armed and managed using policy engines. It will be a policy-based routing solution versus the current static routing tables exercised on the soft switch backbone today. This will allow us to, as I mentioned, grab and route 911 calls in this native SIP environment. And if you haven't heard, the DOD CIO has also required the unclassified VoIP network to move from ASSIP to commercial SIP to be able to support this mission as we go forward. ASSIP is being elevated to the SIPRNet, so all your command and control voice users will be, if they're not already, moved over to the EC VoIP platform. Pillar 2 is the wireless piece that I mentioned about. So most of it, as I talked about, is the LMR upgrade activities that are happening with the P25 integration, looking at the FirstNet activity and the RF range extension. But one of the key pieces here is developing an actual enterprise strategy for wireless. And what does that mean? I don't know how many of you are familiar with LMR architectures, but most of the installations today have dedicated infrastructure where they have their own core, and those cores are managing the actual radio base station environments and then the handsets local to that. We're looking at the future where those cores could actually be a capability hosted in the cloud within an IL5 environment. And as such, integrate these ISSI gateways to be able to support connectivity to disparate systems. So Motorola is proprietary to Motorola, Harris is proprietary to Harris. If I want to be able to create talk paths between them, I am going to need to employ this ISSI technology to create those interoperability points. And being able to do that within a hosted environment at an IL5 space is what we're looking to do to build out a DoD-wide enterprise to support the radio systems across the installations. We're in the throes of also evaluating 5G. How does 5G play in this space from a public safety perspective? Because that's coming. 5G is going to have an impact on FirstNet here eventually. And there's a lot of possibilities that 5G brings to the first responder community that doesn't exist today. Some of that, I think Sridhar talked on a little bit about the video streaming. So Washington, D.C. is a good use case where they're using a number of in-place cameras mounted on utility poles and what have you. And if there's an accident or an incident, the 911 operators are getting live video feeds and getting eyes on, actually, of those incidents instead of relying strictly on a 911 call. You also have the ability with your smartphones to be able to capture live video. And you see that quite often. People, instead of doing anything to help, the first thing they do is break out their phone to record the incident. Okay. So the cartoon here is a quick representation of that cloud structure I was talking about for LMR, where we're looking at putting the cores in a hosted environment and then networking them over the DOD to support crosstalk interoperability between separate subsystems. So Pillar 3 is new. We just kicked this off. This is focused on Internet of Things. This is taking legacy alarm panels that we have out in the field today for both fire and burg and getting them converted over into an IP enterprise. So this is all part of our IoT strategy going forward. And then lastly, as I mentioned, on the mass warning and notification function, a little back history on that, but the Army is working on an enterprise architecture that they'll be announcing soon, probably as early as this summer, on the way ahead for mass warning and notification. I think that's the last slide, John. Over to you.
Sit too long. Anyways, I want to thank the panelists, and if we have any questions, any, Admiral.
Microphone. There you go.
Great panel. This is such an important area for DOD, for the Navy and the Marine Corps. And I'm so glad, John, that you started with 988. 8 sailors in less than a year committed suicide in Newport News, Newport News, Virginia. Not Norfolk, not Virginia Beach, Newport News. We are failing our sailors in suicide prevention, and we need to do better. Very encouraged to also see that at VoIP we've made the translations, but I also note that DOD CIO declared victory and said we've solved 988 for sailors. I hate to burst anybody's bubble, nobody calls for suicide help on a government line. 988 in the States is not fixed. It's state supported under the Department of Transportation program with NEMA, a series of events this summer with all of the state leaders for public safety communications. And they indicated that the decision made by the FCC to not have 988 calls routed over 911 protocols is creating real problems and making the suicide prevention problem worse. And I think it will be further exacerbated within DOD because when a sailor in Newport News calls on their cell phone for suicide assistance, it doesn't go to the Virginia program that the state has really put in to bring local suicide counselors there in Newport News to help. It doesn't go to the VA for military sensitive kind of, we know what your problems and challenges are. It goes to the area code where they bought their phone service from. It goes to their hometown, to Arizona, to Minnesota, so it's a fundamentally different routing challenge, and I would encourage you to get DOD-CIO to add that as an additional pillar broken out in the objective architecture. I'm very concerned that we're representing P25 as the objective interoperability model. I would contend that it has failed us. The interoperability is a tool. It's not the outcome we're looking for. We're looking for affordable choice of devices that will allow us to get end-to-end services connected. The average price of a P25 radio today at the federal level is $7,000 on radio. and it has 1/10 the processing capability, the communication capability, the right size resource block information transfer capability, and didn't evolve naturally into mission critical push to talk. So, this is really a question for you. How will we improve upon the P25 model so that we're not left with a single vendor? There's vendor lock in the federal government around a single vendor for land mobile radios. The very use case, John, that you described in the Navy base, this last year with the exercise, occurred 10 years ago when we had the Navy Yard shooting. And we still couldn't talk across P25 radios then. So the P25 standard, interoperability standard, isn't leading to actual interoperability between jurisdictions. And we need something better than just a standard that a single or a couple of vendors really take advantage of and push us to the market. We need competitive choices so we can afford devices that are less than $7,000 an end unit. And so how will we improve upon the P25 approach?
So one thing on the suicide prevention is that there is an issue with doing the messaging, okay? The DOD Suicide Prevention Office, we're working with them and we're starting to figure out how to get the 988 message out, okay? You haven't seen much of it on TV.
I would recommend you not do that. Right now, if a sailor in Newport News calls 911, 911 is going to get him to a local or a VA help desk. If you encourage all the sailors to call 988, it will exacerbate the problem and they'll be routed to where they got the phone. So, anyway, just a recommendation.
Yeah, then overseas it's a completely different issue to get the military individual to, there is no 988, so we're trying to work through that issue too. Another thing for those, the Defense Suicide Prevention Office issues a report every quarter, and I looked it up this morning. And for the first 3 quarters of 22, which is the latest information, 421 DOD people have committed suicide. Okay, so if you take that, then add the 4th quarter to include the sailors on the Washington, that's going to probably get up close to 500.
30% of the calls made to 911 in the U.S. are suicide referrals. 30%. The PSAPs know what to do with that, and they will connect them with local resources. So until we get 988 routing fixed for veterans, I would worry about the messaging that would take sailors away from a local resource into an environment where they're literally referred to press 1, listen to a message, press 2, the call will be dropped.
So, any other questions?
Yeah, so with reference to what you're talking about, we can't fix the P25 problem because it's not just, everybody can be on P25, but it may not be interoperable. Why? They don't have the same keys, right? So we are working on policies, we are working on it. John talked about ISSI. Well, we just added ISSI and CSSI. We're looking at bridging that interoperability gap, okay? And what's even worse now is we are now, as a public safety, we are fractured, and we are replicating the problems we had on P25 in the broadband area by having applications that are non-standard, non-conformant, non-interoperable. So we're trying to address those problems as well. You know, the market hasn't evolved because there's still a few vendors who are driving it. It's unfortunate, but we are trying our best, and even with mission critical push and talk, we are looking at, are you interoperable? Do you know that if you have mission critical push and talk, 3GPP compliant, you're still not interoperable? You know why? Policy and business. I can't have multi-vendors connect. If I have a Verizon user and an AT&T user, they don't talk to each other right now. We're trying to address those concerns. So yeah, it's a work in progress, and you know, P25 is 30 years old. We're still trying to solve it. So, understand the limitations, but we can't drive the market. We can't drive the prices as federal government. All we can do is increase competition, and we're trying to do that.
Well, DISA drives the market all the time.
Yeah, but legally we can't as federal government. I can't set the price, no matter how much I want, even though that piece of plastic that makes that phone or radio only costs so much. We know that, right? It's the users that have to drive it. We're trying our best.
I just want to agree with you. You could IDIQ multiple service providers and ensure that there's a third. I mean, there's ways to contract to ensure you have alternative vendors built into your approach.
Sir.
Nick Val of Trend Micro. Who wears cybersecurity head within your task force? And what's your cybersecurity strategy to protect PSAPs?
John, you want to take that?
There we go. Okay. Cybersecurity, one of my dear topics. So that's a multifaceted question. So the first thing we're doing from a VoIP perspective is we're going to implement stir shaken on the network to add digital signatures for authenticating calls. That will go a long way to tackling TDOS attacks on the PSAPs themselves. So we're looking at the network first. Then within the PSAP itself, we'll be implementing P25, but PKI certificates and looking at that. But we have a zero trust strategy that's in alignment with the DOD strategy that is going to be a wrapper or an overlay on top of our architecture.
So on the task force, obviously cyber is key. We haven't actually determined how that's going to fold in yet, but we definitely are looking at that. We have CISA involved. For NG911, obviously, with what John mentioned about the attacks, cyber is key, and I just want to call out the JITIC process because, you know, that is such a great process from a cyber perspective. Having gone through that as a company, I would highly recommend any other vendor to go through that, but for all the pain it costs the company, it makes the company a much better company and a much better product. And if everybody did that, our security posture across the board would be so much better. So I just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, so we also funded some research on TDOS attacks, not only spoofing, but also detection. And some of those solutions are being integrated at AT&T and Verizon. So it is flowing down, and we did fund some research to do that.
And within our program, we're writing, updating STIGs to address what we need to do for public safety comms that overlays with VoIP and PSAP, which does the introductions of stir shaking into the DOD ecosystem, because this is going to be brand new for the DOD.
Any other questions? Well, there being none, I thank everybody for coming. And before you leave, I just want to invite you to the Public Safety Comm Symposium that we're going to be holding at the Baltimore Convention Center in association with AFC and TechNet Cyber, May 2nd through the 4th. We're going to have a suicide prevention panel with some key individuals. We're going to be awarding a certificate and so forth to a couple PSAP telecommunicators, because that's at the end of the National Telecommunicators Recognition Week. And then we'll have more time to dive into more details. We're going to have the FCC there, NASNA, NINA. We're going to have JITIC talk about interoperability testing and so forth. So again, May 2nd through the 4th, Baltimore Convention Center. Thank you.